Hey, welcome back everyone. As you can see, I am in front of my new gun wall, gun rack, gun display, rifle display, whatever you want to call it. This is something I put together over the last couple months as a result of a new move and wanted to find a way that I can display these rifles in a really cool and systematic way. And so this is what I put together. I did a video of this a couple months ago on how I put it together, what the process was like, and kind of what costs were involved, so you can go check that out. But today I wanted to show you a little bit about my Carcano rifle collection. Carcanos, as you know, are Italian military rifles that were developed from 1891 and manufactured all the way until 1945, in some cases even after that. And the Carcanos right now in the US surplus market are relatively inexpensive. There's been large imports from Italy itself. They kind of have a reputation for not being good rifles, despite the fact that they are actually really fantastic and well manufactured firearms. And so I kind of took the opportunity over the last couple of years to snatch up as many Carcanos as I can. Carcanos are not only fun to shoot, but they have a lot of history behind them, despite the fact that there is some older generations that view Carcanos as sort of junk rifles. So I wanted to take you through the beginning of my Carcano collection, starting with the 1891 long rifle and ending with sort of our Model 41 rifle. So anyway, without further ado, you've got the Model 1891 long rifle, and I believe the top might be cut off a little bit from your screen. The Model 1891 long rifle was sort of it was a state-of-the-art weapon in the 1890s, and Europe at that point was moving away from black powder cartridges to smokeless powder cartridges. So what they did was they put together a long rifle, and this time combat distances, or anticipated combat distances, were much larger than they actually were when a lot of these weapons were put into combat use in World War I. So anyway, the main features of the 1891 long rifle: it was loaded by a 6-round Mannlicher style clip, and block clip that was, and it would be loaded right through here. So it's a fast, effective system. It's got a straight bolt with a tube style safety system. That was something that was state-of-the-art at the time. And then of course you have adjustable rear aperture sights up to 2,000 meters, and so again that was anticipated combat distances of 2,000 meters. Of course it has this nice dark walnut appearance to it, and at the time, this would have been a pretty fantastic rifle. Now, Italy in the 1890s was not a particularly wealthy country, and so not a lot of these were actually made in the 1890s. Now, production of the 1891 long rifle didn't really increase or speed up until about the First World War. 1912 is when they started manufacturing them in larger numbers. Italy in the 1890s was not a particularly wealthy country, and so even though this weapon was available, they were still using, in many cases, the older Italian Vetterli rifles. But this was the main long arm used by the Italian armed forces in the First World War, and of course they saw use after the war, but primarily in the First World War. Now, a couple of years after the 1891 long rifle was designed and manufactured, the Italians decided to adopt a second variant of the Carcano for their armed forces, the Model 1891 Moschetto, or Modello Moschetto, or Musketoon, or carbine rifle. It's this rifle right here. And a lot of you know these as sort of having the underfolding pointy bayonet that's kind of on the underbelly of the barrel here. It's obviously much more compact. Now, this rifle was used primarily for cyclists, cavalry units. In fact, many times you'll see this labeled as the cavalry carbine. If you see it online for sale, or you see it used in common vernacular in a lot of forums, or just used by gun owners in general, especially in the United States, they'll be referred to as cavalry carbines. This is technically an incorrect designation. It is a Moschetto, or a musketoon, or carbine rifle. Now, a couple of years after the Italians adopted their original Moschetto variant, they adopted a second Moschetto variant, the Moschetto per truppe speciale, or rifle for special troops, or carbine for special troops. Now, this wasn't a rifle for special forces. It was a rifle for engineers, machine gun crews, individuals who would need a rifle that was a little bit more durable than the original Moschetto, It could use an actual sword bayonet rather than this bayonet. It was a little bit more versatile, but in terms of its function and how it works, there was really no difference between these. Of course, these had bent down bolt handles, while the original model 1891 did have a regular, just straight bolt handle. Now, these three rifles would serve Italy through the Great War or the First World War for us Americans. And what happened was, after the First World War, the Italians kind of realized, and a lot of powers realized at this point, that a lot of the weapons that they were using in this conflict were a lot longer and larger lengthwise than what was actually needed for those sort of combat distances. You're seeing combat in battlefields, trench fighting that was really maybe 200 to 400 meters rather than 2,000 meters. And so you have this long, bulky rifle that's heavy, when what you really need is something that is smaller, a carbine variant. And so a lot of countries started reducing or shortening the size of their rifles. Now, Italy in the 1920s, after the war was over with, was relatively broke. They didn't have a lot of money. Most powers in Europe were pretty much bankrupt at this point, and going into new production of rifles was not something that they really had an interest in. Well, they certainly had an interest in doing it, they just couldn't afford it. So Italy, where basically the state apparatus wanted to create a new universal rifle for their armed forces. Well, basically with a country on the verge of a depression, and there's not really a whole lot of money that was, or state money that was allocated for military funding, they had to do with what they had. So you have the Moschetto Modello 91 or 1891/24, so the model 1891/1924. They introduced what was considered a new designation rifle. So basically, it's not a whole lot different than these other Moschetto variants, but what they did was, because they weren't doing or weren't creating a new production line of Carcano rifles, they took a lot of the existing 1891 long rifles and cut them down to musketoon or carbine lengths. Now, the Italian government, not having a lot of money allocated towards new military production of small arms, decided to take existing stocks and do something a little bit more resourceful. They took existing 1891 long rifles and they cut them down to carbine lengths. You can pretty much use a lot of existing parts you have. You can use these 1891 long rifles that, let's be fair, during the Great War were used and abused quite a bit. So barrels were worn out, parts were worn out, and so they were just being resourceful with what they had in order to save money during a time where it just wasn't really an option. And so this is what you get, the 1891/24. Now, in the late 1920s, Italy was sort of running low on existing parts that they could use to make these new rifles or repair old rifles. And so they decided they needed to do a new run of production. Well, they weren't quite ready in a state to design their ideal weapon, which was a universal rifle that they could issue to all branches and all armed forces. Well, what can we do? Well, we can basically just do another production run of the original carbine variants. So what the Italians did was they did a new production of rifles called the Modello 1891 Moschetto Modificato, or modified. Now, right off of the initial appearance, there doesn't seem to be a lot of differentiation between these rifles, but there were some subtle stuff. For example, instead of having these bulky aperture sight, they decided to keep sort of these smaller adjustable sights. They kept the length relatively the same. Of course, all the bolt and safety and firing mechanisms the same. However, they decided to, use the regular nose cap and keep the additional barrel band right here, just for stability and strength. And it also allowed them to utilize old existing parts. The reason they didn't go back to the original Moschetto per Truppa Speciale design was because the single nose cap was considered not strong enough for what they needed, and they wanted to be able to put on a side-mounted sling. When the Italian military was basically creating the model 1891/24, there was a lot of military units or branches that requested a side-mounted sling rather than a underhanded sling. And so a lot of these rifles adopted dual sling systems. So, for example, the 24 has a dual sling system, and the model 1891 Moschetto Modified has this dual sling system. And so having this barrel band gave it a little bit extra strength and allowed them to have this side-mounted sling. Well, that's great. So they've got their new production of rifles. Italy has starting to get, at this point, they're under fascist rule. There's the rise of nationalism in Europe at this time. Italy wants to project itself as a world power. It's getting into a lot more colonial conflicts with its colonies in Africa, especially Ethiopia, Somaliland. And so they need more weapons to procure their military. Now, Italy is gearing up for a larger military conflict, and they ultimately wanted to modernize their armed forces. There had been, of course, like we were saying, military expeditions into Ethiopia in the 1930s. And this was a time where Italy could actually kind of create their ideal universal rifle. And so what this entailed was they wanted to adopt first a new caliber. So they got rid of the 6.5 Carcano cartridge. This is a 6.5 millimeter cartridge compared to the Germans, which were using the 8 millimeter cartridge. And the reason for this change is the Italians wanted something that was a little bit heavier and something a little bit more hard hitting for their cartridge, something a little bit closer to a British 303. And so what the Italians did was they adopted the Model 38. Now the Model 38 had a couple differentiations between the other Carcano designs. First, they did keep the Mannlicher style loading system. Mannlicher style loading system is a very good system. It's hard to replace something that efficient. You can load a magazine of 6 cartridges very quickly. It has the tube style safety system, which also was fantastic. Why change all your machinery when you could just kind of keep it all the same? That's one less thing that you have to retool. Well, there's a couple differences. First, they wanted it to be just a little bit longer than the Moschettos. You have a little bit more of a reach, and you're adopting a new caliber for this. And as you can see here, they adopted fixed rear sights. So no more really having to adjust your sights. Now, Ian McCollum talks about this in his videos as well, about the Carcanos. This wasn't something where the average Italian soldier was not intelligent, or the average Italian soldier couldn't adjust their sights. But this does reduce, one, the Italians being very resourceful economically. That means less parts they have to tool on this kind of fixed sights, on these adjustable sights. So you just have one really tooled piece of metal, which makes your production less costly. But it also does reduce sort of the need to adjust. So if you just have this fixed at 200 meters and you expect combat distances to really be between 100 to 200 meters or even 300 meters, there's really no reason to have a rear sight that goes up to 2,000 meters, or in these Moschettos, 15 or 1,600 meters. It's just not a necessary thing to include. Now, the Italian military at this point was gearing up for fast, lightning strike mobile warfare. And I know that sounds a little bit cliche when we talk about like the German military during this time or the American military during this time. The Italians were really thinking, why do you need a adjustable sight that goes up to 1,600 meters when combat distances are realistically going to be between 100 and 300 meters? It really makes sense. And like we said earlier, it reduces the number of moving parts that you have in a rifle. That reduces maintenance. You're more economical with your production. You don't have to, return as many rifles in the field. That just makes a lot of sense to have a fixed rear sight. Again, this has nothing to do with the individual intelligence of the soldier. Now, this rifle kind of had something for everyone. It was generally universal. It could be used by pretty much all branches of the armed forces. It was light, maneuverable. You could sling it over your shoulder. You could ride on horseback. You could be in an armored vehicle. You could be an infantryman. And so this really was a great design. The only problem was logistics. When you are manufacturing a new rifle and a new caliber, well, it's going to take a lot of time to build up a stock of those rifles so you can replace all the old existing rifles in the field with this new rifle, especially when you have a different caliber. The last thing you want is your military having several different calibers. It increases the risk of, somebody putting the wrong sort of ammunition in the wrong type of gun. And so the Italians in 1940 got involved in World War II. Well, this rifle was adopted in 1938. 2 years is not enough time to build enough existing stockpile to arm your entire armed forces. So the Italians abruptly stopped. They stopped manufacturing these rifles in 7.35 and said, okay, we need to go back to the 6.5 Carcano cartridge. Well, it was a smart move. There wasn't really anything they could do in terms of, well, for practical reasons. It made sense. And so what do you do with all these rifles that are now chambered in 7.35 that you've created and now you've stopped? They created them roughly from the rifles chambered in 7.35 from roughly 1938 to 1940 when they decided to go back to the 6.5 cartridge. Well, you send them to your allies or you send them to another country. In this case, this rifle was sent to Finland. This was a Finnish contract. Well, it wasn't a Finnish contract rifle. It was a Finnish loaned rifle. And so the Italians sent all their rifles that were in 7.35 to Finland, who Finland eventually used them as rear echelon, basically guard duty rifles. Well, they pretty much had tooled this design. And so what do? Well, you continue making the same rifle, just in a different caliber. So they continued making the Model 38 in the 6.5 Carcano cartridge. And again, a smart move not to change a lot of the other designs that were part of it. It was just pretty much a barrel replacement. So they continued manufacturing the Model 38 in 6.5 throughout the war. Now the Italians also wanted to make sure that they had these Moschetto, I guess you could say, cavalry carbines for vernacular reasons. But the Moschettos were still manufactured. Again, these are the rifles with the underhand folding bayonets. And then they also had troop specials. And so as you can see, they're a little bit shorter. These are all manufactured originally in 6.5 Carcano, though you can find these also manufactured between 1938 and 1940 in 7.35, though a lot of those were either, again, given to Finland as war aid or, rebarreled for 6.5. And I'll just quickly mention the Moschetto Troop Special Model 38 chambered in 7.92 or 8mm Mauser. A number of Carcano models were converted during the war, World War II, for use by the Volkssturm, but many were converted by the Italian government for the Arab export market in the 1950s and 1960s. With Italy pretty well involved in World War II, you would think that there wasn't a need for a new Carcano design, especially with the limited resources that Italy has available. Well, that's where you'd be wrong, because in 1941, they adopted this rifle right here, the Model 1891/1941. This would be the final and last Carcano design adopted. And of course, it has a lot of the same features that the original Model 1891 long rifle has. And in Ian McCullum's word, he said, this is a step backwards from the current Carcano designs that Italy was using. It had a straight bolt handle. They went back to having an adjustable rear sight. And it's kind of this, again, kind of heavy, bulky rifle. Well, why did they design this? Well, basically, we assume that Italy in 1940, when they invaded southern Greece, they invaded Greece, southern France, they basically found out that they needed a rifle that had a little bit of a longer reach than the Model 38s and, of course, the Moschettos. You're fighting in, large mountain passes where having a little bit more of a reach, like 1,000 meters, actually made a little bit more practical sense rather than these fixed rear sights, which were basically sighted in for only a couple hundred meters. And so in preparation for, I guess, more combat theaters where you would have long ranges, the Italians adopted this rifle just in time for Operation Barbarossa, which Italy took part in. This was, of course, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. We are going to have not necessarily mountains, but you're going to have longer distances of combat. So anyway, this was still arguably a step backwards. I'm not sure it really made sense or really had a big impact on Italy's war effort, but that's what they did. Now, the other and final Italian, I guess you could say, Carcano rifle in my collection that I wanted to show you all was the Italian Type I, or the Carcano Type I. Now, what's interesting about this is actually chambered not in 7.35 or 6.5 Carcano, it's chambered in 6.5 Japanese. And so in the early 1940s, the Italians had an exchange program with the Japanese Navy and supplied the Japanese with this Type I Carcano. very similar in length and design to the Japanese Type 38, as you can see right here. So yeah, chambered in the 6.5 Japanese. However, it did keep the original bolt that the Carcanos had. It didn't have a Mannlicher style loading system. It had a typical Mauser loading system here with a stripper clip. And then, of course, kept the same rear sights. So it was part of an arms exchange program that Italy had with Japan, which was kind of interesting. So this is my last sort of Carcano Arisaka hybrid rifle, if you want to call it that. So anyway, interesting piece of history. Anyway, guys, this is my Carcano collection. I hope you kind of enjoyed me walking you through that. But I hope to maybe add a few more in the near future. So again, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.